Hey, thanks for stopping by, seriously, because you're about to hear something that sounds like a joke until you realize nobody in the room was laughing. Picture a family dinner where your uncle, the one who spent 30 years lecturing everyone about the dangers of big government, suddenly leans back, grins, and says he'd actually be pretty great at running. The very system he's spent his whole life warning you about. Everyone goes quiet, someone's fork stops halfway to their mouth, and you're left wondering whether he's joking, whether he's testing you, or whether he's just said the thing he actually believes out loud by accident. That, more or less, is what happened at a NATO summit this week, except the uncle was the President of the United States, the dinner table was a press conference in Ankara, Turkey, and the fork that stopped midair belonged visibly to his own Secretary of State. Now here's the setup, because context matters here more than usual. Trump had just wrapped a NATO summit that, according to his own framing, was a tremendous success. His word used roughly the way other people use punctuation. He'd praised the Turkish president, praised the NATO Secretary General as a unifier, and was fielding a few final questions before, in his words, everyone went home. And then a reporter from NTD and the Epoch Times asked him something that, on paper, sounds like an easy layup. He'd been issuing a wake-up call to Americans at home about the dangers of communism. And now he was speaking on the world stage. So what was his message to people living under communist regimes? And to people in democracies who might not realize how close communism had come to their own front door? A softball. The kind of question designed to let a president say something statesmanlike about liberty. Pravda NATO. He did not do that. What he did instead was tell the room that communism is easy to sell, that he personally would be the greatest communist in history, and that he'd be right up there with Lenin, not as bad as Lenin, not compared unfavorably to Lenin, right up there with him, as good as anybody. And then he kept going, sketching out his imagined communist pitch. Free rent, free houses, we'll take it away from somebody, we'll give it to you. Before pivoting, almost as an afterthought, to the part where you die in squalor, which is, if you think about it for even 4 seconds, a genuinely strange rhetorical structure. You do not usually see a sitting president cast himself as the villain of his own cautionary tale, complete with a full character voice, at a military alliance summit, in front of the actual cameras of the actual world press. And this is where Rubio comes in, because somewhere in that room, standing exactly where the cameras could catch him, was the Secretary of State, a man who has built roughly the entire architecture of his political identity on being the guy who takes communism dead seriously. Cuban exile family, decades of speeches about Havana and squalor that wasn't a punchline. And in that moment, as his boss cheerfully cast himself as Lenin's understudy for the assembled international press corps, Rubio's face did the thing faces do when the part of your brain responsible for diplomacy and the part of your brain responsible for honesty briefly stop cooperating with each other. That face is now circulating everywhere, because of course it is. It's a more honest piece of communication than anything either man said out loud that day. Here's what I think is actually happening underneath the joke, because I don't think this was really about global communism at all. Notice the emphasis. The president wasn't warning the world about Havana or Beijing or Pyongyang. He was talking about communism forming in the country and his country. This is structurally a domestic messaging exercise wearing an international summit as a costume. He's been building this communism at home narrative for a while now, and using a NATO stage to do it means the message gets carried home by the same cameras that are supposed to be covering troop commitments and defense spending. 2 audiences, 1 soundbite, and frankly, it's a fairly efficient use of a plane ticket. But here's the part that should bother you more than the Lenin joke, and it's the part almost nobody's talking about, because it got buried under the meme. In that same press conference, the president told reporters that the country is in more danger right now from this vaguely defined communist threat than it was during World War I, World War II, September 11th, or Pearl Harbor. Sit with that comparison for a second. 2 world wars, 3,000 people dead in a single morning in September. A surprise attack that pulled an entire nation into a global conflict. And the standard he's measuring against all of that is a rhetorical mood he can't quite define beyond its forming. That's not a policy position. That's not even really a warning. That's a scale with nothing on one side of it. Now, of course, the White House will tell you this is being taken out of context, that it was obviously a joke, that the president often uses exaggeration to make a point, and to be fair, that's true, he does, constantly. And most of the time, nobody bats an eye because everyone's learned to translate it in real time. But there's a difference between everyone knows to discount this by 40% and the actual Secretary of State visibly could not discount it fast enough. Rubio didn't laugh along. He didn't nod. His face did the one thing a diplomat's face is trained never to do on camera, which is tell you what he's actually thinking. And that's really the story here, if you strip away the Lenin bit entirely. It's not that the president made a bizarre communism joke at a NATO summit. He says bizarre things constantly. That's practically a load-bearing feature of his public persona at this point. It's that the joke landed in a room specifically full of people whose entire job is to maintain a consistent, credible message to 40-some allied governments. And it visibly cracked at least one of them, on camera, in real time, in a way that will now outlive the summit itself, the defense spending pledges, and whatever Erdogan said about being a wonderful host. For the United States specifically, the consequence isn't really about communism at all. It's about predictability, or the absence of it. Allied governments don't build their defense budgets, their procurement decisions, their public messaging around a partner they can't script for. Every time a moment like this goes viral, it doesn't just become a punchline back home. It becomes evidence in real time that the country is the only one laughing anymore, as one commenter put it, while everyone else quietly recalculates how much weight to put on the next American promise. That's the actual cost, not the joke. The recalculation. And domestically, the reaction tells you something too, because this wasn't a partisan pile-on in the usual sense. A chunk of the backlash came from Fox News' own audience, the crowd this messaging was theoretically built for. One viewer called the comparison to Lenin pure narcissism, and that's notable because when the built-in audience starts publicly wincing at the bit, you've probably wandered outside whatever the intended message was supposed to be. So, where does that leave us? The president gets to walk away calling the summit tremendous, because he calls everything tremendous. It's basically a weather pattern at this point. Rubio gets to spend the next several days explaining, with visible effort, that his face was doing something other than what 40 million people watched it do. And communism, the actual historical thing with actual victims and actual body counts, gets reduced to a bit about free housing and squalor, delivered between a thank you to the Turkish president and a fairly testy exchange about whether Iranian leaders are nice people or sick people this week, depending on the news cycle, which, incidentally, is its own segment for another day. I'll say this much for the moment, and then I'll let you go. In a room built entirely around projecting unity, discipline, and a united front to 40-some allied nations, the most honest thing anyone communicated all day was a face that forgot to hold still. I'm not sure that's the legacy anyone in Ankara was going for, but it might be the only part of the summit that actually told the truth.